The second big mistake that anglers make when they're crankbait fishing is they get the wrong casting angle, whether they're fishing offshore or up shallow. Casting angles are absolutely critical when you're offshore fishing because the bait needs to be getting in the strike zone and you need to be hitting a very small spot. And even though it's pretty important offshore, it's even more critical up shallow. And so I'm going to start by talking about the offshore casting angles with some graphics, and then I'll let Randy get into the shallow water casting angles. And while I'm talking about this, Randy, pull up graphics. If you could pull up Google Earth and just kind of have that ready to share so you can kind of show us casting angles for some shallow cranking stuff. So let me pull up Navionics here, and I'll at least start with the offshore crankbait fishing. So let me pull up Navionics. There we go. And whenever I am trying to pick a crankbait spot, one of the key things I'm looking for, and I'm just going to go to Grand Lake because it's a great crankbait lake, is you're trying to find a place where there's some sort of depth change. I'm going to give you a really obvious example here in the back of Drowning Creek. Here is a really obvious ledge where the bottom goes from shallow water, let's say 3 to 5 feet of water, and drops into 30 feet of water with a very abrupt depth change. This is what you call ledge, and throwing crankbaits offshore on ledges is one of the best ways to catch fish. You can also catch fish, though, on areas like this, which is called a point. And a point is an area where you have shallow water that sticks out to the lake and then drops off into deeper water. In both these cases, you have shallower water, 5 to 7 feet, dropping into deeper water, around 20 feet. Now, this is a shallower spot, but you could also find ledges that are deeper than this. You could go over here and find a ledge where the top of the ledge is in 20 feet of water, or the top of the point is in 20 feet of water, and it drops off into 40 or 60 feet of water. Regardless of the depth of water you're fishing, though, and I'm going to go back to our example because it's just a little bit cleaner, the key is that you want to make sure that your bait is in the area where the depth changes from shallower to deeper water as long as possible. And that's where your key strike zone is usually on these offshore areas. It's basically where these contour lines go from being very spread apart to very tight together. And you're not actually trying to fish your crankbait where the lines are tight together. It's actually going to be about 10 to 15 feet up onto the flatter portion. So up here, or kind of up in this area. You don't want to be right where the contours break super tight. You want to be where they start to flatten out a little bit, 10 to 15 feet up on top of those areas. That's where most of your offshore fish are going to be setting up. It's kind of like the feeding table for the fish. The flatter sections, that's where the fish feed. And the key to fishing a crankbait offshore is that you need to make sure that you're positioning your boat in a way that your bait is landing up on top of the flat, getting down to depth, and then landing in the strike zone. What this means is that you don't want to actually position your boat too far out in the middle of the lake. I see a lot of guys when they try crankbait fish, they'll put their boat out here in 20, 25 feet of water, and when they make their casts, their bait is landing right on the edge of the ledge, right where the contour lines start to get tighter together. What happens is that your bait is actually landing right on top of where the fish are, but because of the nature of a crankbait, it has to dive down first before it gets to the fish. So if I pull up that handy dandy PowerPoint here again, what's happening is that a lot of guys are casting their crankbaits out and their baits are hitting the actual, actually let me grab this. I'll give you a better example of an actual ledge. This is what I'm talking about here. So here's some fish. Here's a fish on the ledge. And you can see they're kind of not on the downslide right here. That downslide, that's the same thing as like where those contour lines are tight together. That right there is the exact same as this right here. These fish are setting up on top of the drop. And what'll happen is a lot of guys will cast their crankbait. They'll have it land right on top of where the fish are, but then it has to dive down for like a third of the cast. And by the time the bait actually gets down to the depth, it's nowhere close to the fish. It's way out in front of the ledge. It's over deeper water, and they never actually get bit. Therefore, you actually have to make sure your bait lands well past the fish, can dive down to depth, and then go through the fish like this. And that's why a lot of guys just do not catch fish on crankbaits, because they never get their bait where the fish actually are. They cast their bait to where they think the fish are, but they forget to account for the diving time. And usually it takes about a third of the cast for that bait to get down to depth, maybe even more than that, sometimes half the cast to get that bait down to depth. So if I was going to set up on Navionics here, what I would be trying to do is I would basically be trying to get my bait to land pretty far up on top of the flat or pretty far up on top of this point. What this means is I need to position my boat pretty close to that drop, almost right on the lip where that where the lake starts to come up, where the drop starts to come up. So if we pull up that image again, just to kind of give you guys an idea, where you would want to position that your boat is pretty much right where the drop ends, right where the bottom starts to kind of flatten out again in the channel. So right about here, this will allow you to make a long cast way past the fish and then dive through those fish. That's the key with fishing a deep diving crankbait. And if we kind of pull it back up, your boat's sitting here more in the channel, you're casting way up on the flat and reeling it in. And this might mean that your bait is grinding into the bottom. And I've actually caught fish off this exact spot right here on a 6XD crankbait. And I put that bait, it was actually a little bit more out towards the end here, and the fish were setting up in like 9 to 10 foot of water, but I was still throwing a 6XD crankbait that went 15 feet deep. All I did was I adjusted my line size. I went to a little bit heavier line so the bait dove a little bit shallower. And my bait was actually landing in 5 feet of water and it was grinding on the bottom until I got to those fish. And I was digging up mud. But then when I got to the strike zone, my bait was already on the bottom and those fish were just absolutely crushing it. So that is the key with these offshore casting angles with your crankbait. And it has to do with getting the bait down to the bottom, but also just making sure that you're in the strike zone as long as possible. So that's all I had right there. So Randy, let's jump back over to you and maybe have you share your screen and talk about some shallow water crankbait casting angles.
Okay.
While he's doing that, guys, since we have some time, go down below and hit the like button on this live stream and also go down and hit the subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed to this YouTube channel, we're going to be making supercuts of all of the content from this live stream. Every point we talk about, we're going to actually make a quick YouTube video about it on this channel. And if you don't want to miss upcoming live streams on the new Fish the Moment live channel, go subscribe. This is not the Fish the Moment channel. This is actually a brand new YouTube channel. So go down and subscribe there if you haven't. It'll help us out as well.
Okay, can you see my screen, Johnny?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay, I pulled up Grand Lake here, guys, as an example, because Grand's a really good shallow cranking lake. And first of all, casting angles when you're talking about fishing targets doesn't matter if it's whatever type of cover it is, wood, rock, whatever like that. And I'm talking when we talk about shallow cranking, we're talking like say 7 feet or less, pretty much bank or object oriented. There's a couple different things to remember. First of all, a lot of it has to do with the angle of the bank that you're fishing. Now, say, for example, right here, this is like a main creek, sort of a bluffy, steep bank, bluffy type bank, sharp drops into like 25 or 30 foot of water. Now, if I'm fishing a bank like this, let's say in the pre-spawn, because it's going to be different. If I fish this in the pre-spawn versus like the summer, the fish will be positioned differently. But say that I'm fishing this particular bank when the water temperature, starts to get in the low 50s. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get that bait down in the zone where I believe the fish are, and that's totally relative to the water clarity that you're in. And let's say for at Grand Lake, for example, say we've got like 1.5 feet of visibility. In 1.5 feet of visibility, I sort of know that those bass are going to be sort of in that, probably that 4 to 7 foot range in that visibility. So what I want to do is I want to maximize my time on this bank in that 4 to 7 foot zone. And by doing that, you have to get your boat parallel to the bank, make long casts, probably anywhere, depending upon the bank angle, anywhere between 2 to 3 feet off the bank, to get it down into that 4 to 7 foot zone for the maximum amount of time. And when you're cranking a steep bank of any type, it's very important not to slop your casts out there, because if you cast like a foot too far to the left or a foot too far to the right, your bait's either going to be too shallow or too deep. So when you're fishing these steep vertical banks like this, you need to make sure that your casting accuracy is accurate to get that bait down to the zone you need. You don't ever want to like 45 a bank like this. You want to get close in, all relative to the drop, to keep that bait in that strike zone where you feel the fish are. Now, say, for example, that you're working down this bank right here and you come to this little secondary point here. And again, the water temperature is 55 degrees, water visibility is 1.5 feet. You want to make sure that you fan cast that same zone across the point here. So if I'm coming down the bank right here, right about here, I'm going to be making fan casts, trying to get into that 4 to 8 foot zone across the point. I'm going to come around. I'm not going to make any cast straight into the point. I'm going to come around the opposite side, and I'll make the same cast in the opposite direction on that little secondary point. Because a lot of times when you're cranking shallow water points, and when I'm talking about points, I'm not talking about these obvious type points. I'm talking about little subtle points. They could be only like maybe sticking out 4 or 5 feet. You need to make sure that you come across those points at both angles, because a lot of times you don't know how those rocks are setting up down there. You don't know how those fish are positioned. So I always make casts from 2 different directions of the angles on the secondary points. Okay, now it's taking a different option here. Let's say we go to a little bit flatter banks, and see this right here. You got a steep bank here. You got a transitional bank coming into like gravel, pea gravel, like type of stuff. And anytime you have that transitional change, you're going to have shallower water farther off the bank. So when I get into the transitional areas, like the rock transition areas into flatter areas, that's when I'm moving my boat out and I'm casting at a 45-degree angle. Because by casting at that 45-degree angle, I'm hitting that sweet spot of like 4 to 7 foot deep on that 45-degree angle cast. I'm not tied in. I'm not out throwing straight in. I'm casting at a 45 on those flatter banks. Again, your casting angle on the shallow cranking is relative to how the bank drops off and how deep the water is, how deep you want the bait to go, water clarity, and that type of stuff. Okay, now let's go back, and I'll take you to the back of the creek here, and I'm gonna show you about really my favorite type of shallow cranking, which is on shallow wood. To me, when you're talking about shallow cranking, it's basically going to be a wood or a rock deal for the most part. I prefer wood because I just think that you catch more quality fish off of wood. So we'll zoom out on this flat here, this main lake flat. You got some isolated laydowns out on this flat here. Now, I don't care what time of year you're fishing. If you're fishing this, this is like 3 or 4 foot of water all around this. There's no breaks, no deep water. It's just a big flat, 3 to 4 foot deep with an isolated laydown tree there. This is where shallow cranking becomes an art form. And anytime you have water temperatures that are like above 60 degrees, 60 to 90 degrees, and these fish are starting to use this type of cover, casting angle on this type of stuff is critical. And so what you want to do is, like, say your boat's coming in from this direction. Before you get to the cover, you want to take note of different things. You want to take note of the wind direction, the angle of the sun. You want to look at the cover and find out where the shady sides are, where the sunny sides are, and you want to position your boat way before you get to the piece of cover to make that optimum cast on that piece of cover. Because for the most part, if there's a bass there, you're going to catch that bass within the first 2 or 3 casts, or you're going to catch it after like 25 casts. There's not like much in between. There's either going to be a good aggressive fish ready to bite on a laydown like this, or any other type of isolated cover, or there's going to be a fish there that's non-aggressive that you got to trigger from a different casting angle. So what I want to do is I take all this to consideration. First of all, I determine the wind direction. I don't want my boat drifting into the cover, so I want to make sure that I position the boat where I have complete control of the boat, where I don't drift in too close to the cover, where I'm not too far away. I want to make sure my boat's coming at the right angle. Then I analyze where the shady part is, and I make my first cast anywhere that shade is. I'm trying to hit that shade. And then based upon how the piece of cover is fishing, I want to try to go parallel to everything because it gives you more of an ambush point. Once I've made 5 or 6 casts from that particular angle, that's when I'll get the boat out a little bit further and I'll start firing off different casts from different angles. I'll come in, crossways to it. I'll maybe throw over a piece of wood and get that crankbait to come up over the wood and down the other side. And then I just try to make as many casts to that piece of isolated cover that I can to trigger that non-aggressive fish. So, and this is the same anytime you've got any type of isolated cover. It can be a rock, it could be an isolated dock, it can be a laydown, it could be an isolated grass clump, it could be a lot of different structures. But the biggest thing you need to remember when you're determining the angle that you need to cast from is, getting that bait in the high percentage area on your first 2 or 3 casts with that. Don't slop through an area. You need to be stealthy. You need to come up on it slow, and that's going to make a big determination in that. The other thing would be laydowns on the bank, like this right here. You got this bank with a lot of laydowns on it. When you're fishing laydowns that come off a bank, again, your casting angle is critical. Say, for example, let's see this tree right here. If I'm coming down this particular bank right here, and I've got this tree here, say the water's 5 foot deep on the end, the casting angle I want to have, my first cast to this piece of cover right here, and obviously it would be better if it's isolated, but there's a lot of laydowns here. But my first cast here, the angle is going to come parallel to the outside of this tree right here, because first of all, there's probably some limbs underwater that you can't see. So by me making a cast completely parallel to that laydown right there, I'm going to hit whatever deeper limbs are. And then once I get closer to it, my casting angle is going to be parallel to the outside on both sides. And then maybe I'll make a cast in between some nooks and crannies in the middle there. So basically, shallow cover, the things you need to remember: pay attention to the depth, pay attention to the angle of the bank, the water visibility, and the wind and the shade before you make your casting angle.
That has some golden information there, guys. If you were not taking notes, rewatch that segment. We'll post this as its own video on the channel too. But that was some really good stuff there, Randy. That's like 30 years of crankbait knowledge combined in about 10 minutes there. That was awesome.
Well, there's a lot more to it. That's the thing about it. It's like we could talk for 3 or 4 hours on how to fish this laydown tree out here. Because when you start, just say, for example, on this laydown tree, you got not only you have the casting angles, but you got to hit on the right combination of color, line size, speed of retrieve, cadence, hesitation. Things change with, the sunlight conditions, light penetrations, fishing pressure. It's just, that's why, again, fishing is the most complicated sport on the planet. So much to it.
Good stuff. Well, I'm going to answer a couple questions here, and then I'm going to jump to the next question, or the next reason why anglers struggle, the next mistake. One comment we had was from Ryan. He said, a lot of good info, but I've noticed you use Grand Lake for all your comparisons. Not every lake fishes like Grand Lake. What about the deep, clear southern reservoir? Things like that. Well, the information we're talking about here, guys, it can relate to pretty much any fishery around the country. The information we're giving is not specific to Grand Lake. We're just using it as an example lake because Grand Lake has clearer water, has dirtier water, has steeper banks, shallower banks. And actually, Grand Lake is a great lake to kind of use as a catch-all. It's not going to catch everything, but just to give you an idea of a deep, clear southern reservoir, Ryan, here's Lake Lanier. The 10-foot of water visibility spotted bass. The exact same things Randy and I are talking about with the casting angles, with the bait selection, all of those apply to Lake Lanier as well. The big thing that's going to be different, though, is that crankbaits are not going to be universally successful in all water clarities and all conditions. If you're fishing on Lake Lanier, you're going to struggle to catch fish on a crankbait, except for in very specific seasons of the year, down by the dam in 10-foot water visibility. Maybe only during like the pre-spawn time of the year, or maybe like the late fall, early winter, can you actually go catch fish on a crankbait really well in the lower end of Lake Lanier. However, if you go up towards the dirtier part of Lake Lanier, up some of the rivers, there's a lot of great crankbait water. And if you basically have less than 4 foot of visibility, you should be able to get on a good crankbait bite. That's kind of the key water visibility that's going to help you catch more fish. So even if you are on a clear reservoir like a Lake Lanier, 10 foot of visibility, go find water that has less than 4 foot of visibility, and you can find that in almost any lake across the country. Go find that more stained water, and you'll be able to apply everything we're talking about with crankbaits. If you do want to try to catch fish on crankbaits in clear water, you either need to have some sort of heavy wind or heavy cloud cover, and you also need to have the fish positioned in shallower water. 80% of the year on Lake Lanier, your spotted bass and your largemouth are going to be chasing blueback herring out in the middle of the lake, and you need to use swim baits and other things to go catch those fish. But when those fish are up on the bank in the pre-spawn or the late winter, or maybe even like the late fall, early winter time, some of those largemouth and spy bass will be up on these shallower banks, and you can catch them in ways that Randy was talking about. So you have to be there. Again, there's so many factors you could get into. I've made some really good videos explaining the best winter crankbait areas on the Fish the Moment YouTube channel, so check those videos out. Just type in Fish the Moment winter cranking. I've made a bunch of videos talking about that. I've made a lot of crankbait videos in general, but that is one thing we had. Another question is from Mike: can you back or float out a deep diving crankbait similar to how you can with a square bill? And what you're probably talking about there, Mike, is, and if you could stop sharing your screen here real quick, Randy, is a lot of times when you get a crankbait hung, you can kind of like do the buggy whip, or kind of like the arrow where you like take your line and pop the bait free. And you can sometimes do that with deep diving crankbait, but one technique that works really well for me is one, I start by dropping a plug knocker down, like a Hound Dog plug knocker from Jewel. It's a really good one. It's called the Hound Dog, and you can find it at Tackle Warehouse. And you can drop that thing down and get the crankbait free. But if not, one thing I've done in the past is just reel down as far as you can on that crankbait. Get directly over the top of the crankbait, reel down as tight as you can get your line, and then pull up really quickly and snap your line. A lot of times that will rebound that crankbait back and it'll float up. And I would say about 30 to 40% of the time, when you get straight over the crankbait, reel really tight, and pull straight above that bait really fast and pop the bait or break your line, that bait will float back up. And it's about 30 to 40% of the time you get your bait back. So just a way to save a couple crankbaits here and there.